This is Religion Unplugged, an interview series about the impact of religion in public life around the world. For this episode, I interviewed Jeffrey Allen Miller, an English professor at Montclair State University in New Jersey. He made a major discovery in 2015. Looking at a notebook in an archive at the University of Cambridge, Miller came across the earliest known draft of any part of the King James Bible. For this discovery, along with his other scholarship on John Milton, he was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship this year, which is commonly referred to as a Genius Grant in America. So let's go to Jeffrey Allen Miller's office and hear what he has to say. I'm here today in the office of Professor Jeffrey Allen Miller, and I want to talk to him today about, we won't bury the lead here, about some discoveries he has made, which has earned him one of the most prestigious prizes for academics and creative people in our country, called the MacArthur Fellowship. It's sometimes called the Genius Award. It comes with honor and prestige and money.
My name is Lin-Manuel Miranda, and I'm a composer and a performer. I guess more than anything, what this fellowship is it's such a huge vote of confidence and allows me to keep going.
I want to hear the backstory, Jeff, about what did you find that earned you this honor?
Earned is a tricky word. I'm not sure I did earn it, but at least the reason they say it was very kindly awarded to me. I think the most prominent thing that I identified or discovered was what is now the earliest known draft of any part of the King James Bible. So I found or identified it. We already knew that this particular manuscript existed, but it had been cataloged as being something different than what it turned out to be. And it is an early, seemingly first draft of a part of the King James translation, which was first published in 1611. It is the earliest known draft of any part of the translation at this point. There were a few other drafts of the King James Bible that had been previously identified, but they all belong to later stages in the composition process after a great deal of work on the translation had already been done. The other thing that's really interesting about this draft that I identified is it is the only draft of the King James translation yet to be identified that is definitively in the hand of one of the known translators of the King James Bible. So it's written in the hand of a man named Samuel Ward. We know it's his hand. And so it provides a real rare, unique opportunity to see one of the translators of one of this most important works ever produced in any language, really, working out what will become portions of the King James Bible, seemingly for the first time by hand in this draft. So it's a really unique document.
Well, tell us how, we'll come back to Samuel Ward in a moment, but tell us how he and others were, doing the translation, the teamwork aspect here, the organizational dynamics, which are kind of interesting.
Right. So the King James Bible was first commissioned by the newly ascended James I in 1604. And it was initially divided into 6 teams or companies of translators, together totaling around 50 men. 2 teams were based in Oxford, 2 based in Cambridge, and 2 based in Westminster, what we would just call Greater London today. And each of these teams, each team consisting around 7 to 8 people, was assigned a particular segment of the Bible. So Team 1, say in Westminster, was assigned Genesis through, I think, Second Kings, maybe, or something like that. And then, the team that Samuel Ward was a part of was assigned the Old Testament Apocrypha and things like that. So each of these teams were assigned different portions of the Bible. And they were then initially just basically said to produce a revised version of a previous English translation known as the Bishop's Bible. So rather than the King James Bible being supposed to have been an entirely new translation composed afresh from scratch, so to speak, it was to be explicitly a revision of this previous English translation known as the Bishop's Bible. So that was how it was structured. That was what these groups of translators were supposed to be doing. And then there was a second part of the project after all these translators each team had produced a kind of draft of its portion of the Bible. Mm-hmm. Those drafts were passed on up the chain, and 2 members from each of the translation companies then met together in London on a kind of super committee to revise the work into a kind of whole. One of the things that's interesting about what Ward's draft shows is that the King James Bible, precisely because rather than assigning individual people to individual books, rather assigning teams of people to groups of books, this was a departure from the way that previous English translations of the Bible seem to have been done. The King James Bible is often, this is seen sometimes to have been a kind of a key to its success, a key to its greatness. It's been called a miracle of committee work and things like that. Yeah. One of the things that Ward's draft shows is that at least one of the teams of translators, at least in part, didn't do it quite this way that they were supposed to be doing. It seems like Ward's company, he was a member of the so-called second Cambridge company, so the second team in Cambridge. It seems like his company did at least initially begin the process by assigning individual books or parts of books to individual translators, which is actually not something that they were supposed to be doing. But once you realize that that is in fact what at least one of the companies was doing, and maybe others in different ways, certain parts of the King James translation that have previously not made a ton of sense suddenly do and start to snap into focus a little bit. So that's one of the things that Ward's draft shows rather interestingly, is that it changes a little bit how we have traditionally assumed the translation of the King James Bible must have been conducted.
Yeah. I wonder if organizational theory, management people will want to, MBA type, researchers will want to study that, as well as literary and philology.
Well, it is one of the interesting things that there's always a temptation to presume over much continuity with the past. There are times these people they're different people in different ways, and they're approaching things maybe differently than we might today. But there's a reverse temptation of over alienating the past and assuming that all these people back then must have been wholly unlike us in different ways. And actually, one of the things you find is that that's very much not the case. So in Ward's draft, there's evidence to show or suggest, at least strongly, that at least one of the people involved in Ward's company seems to have basically just fallen down on the job or just not done his assigned portion of the task, and that Ward and others seem to have been brought in later to help finish a portion of the translation that another committee member was supposed to have done but then didn't. So that kind of thing where you break up into small groups and different people go at it like gangbusters, and different people just shirk the responsibility altogether, and different people find some sort of middle ground. That's one of the things actually you see happening in the King James Bible itself. So in that sense, it is very much a story sort of straight out of the minutes of any organizational meeting that might have been taking place today.
Yeah, you wonder if King James ever would have brought in McKinsey to do a 360-degree, performance review process.
Well, he seems to have brought in, different high-ranking officials at various points seem to have been brought in to effectively, apply the stick at various places. Let's finish this up, or to take the measure of the situation. And at one point, when after the towards the end of the committee phase, or will prove to be the company or team phase, the earliest part of the translation, it seems like James I basically runs out of patience and said, okay, we're moving on to step 2, whether we're ready or not. And this order seems to have caught a number of the companies by surprise. Like, oh no, now, so, a lot of burning the midnight oil or something on the back end. And you can find places even in Ward's draft and in later drafts that sort of suggest that some parts might have been kind of rushed and others not. And so in that sense, he actually, not quite McKinsey, but he does, the different ways. There are people whose job seems to be to kind of just oversee the whole thing and make sure it's moving forward in the way that James at least wants it to be.
Yeah. Well, the product they ended up with, the King James Bible, what did that do for the English language and the Bible itself for readers who, might not have known that? What did it do?
Well, so, the first thing to say is that it basically changes the language. Every contribution to the language probably changes it some ways. But I think it's fair to say that the King James Bible, shaped the English language as much as anything, with the possible exception of Shakespeare, ever has. It also it became not just, and remains to this day, not just the most widely read English translation of the Bible of all time, but it in fact remains the most widely read work of English writing of all time, surpassing in that respect, at least, even the works of Shakespeare. For huge stretches of time in many households, both around England and throughout the Anglophone world, if you had any one book in your household, it might have been a King James Bible. And so it became something that is sort of the lens through which, linguistically and otherwise, the Bible came to be known. It became a way, sort of the way in which people came to think about their own language, their own history, the way they came to experience English, both native English speakers and non-native English speakers. It has exerted a huge influence, sometimes not always to great effect, on what people often assume great English writing should sound like. And so I think that it's really, it's hard to even, it'd probably be easier to try to come up with a list of things the King James Bible has not shaped in some way than it would be to come up with a list of the things that it has, because that list seems virtually endless.
Right. I think the same was true of Martin Luther in Germany. I can't remember what exact year in relation to the King James Bible, but when
it's around 100 years earlier is when Luther supposedly nails his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg.
And his Bible didn't, as I understood, helped codify German language.
Absolutely. And also that impulse to translate that, at the time, the kind of emotive Protestant impulse to translate the Bible into vernacular languages exerted a huge influence itself on the King James Bible. They're looking at German vernacular Bibles. They're looking at vernacular Bibles in other languages. They're looking at versions of the Bible in Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, and so Latin, obviously, the learned language of the day. And so that also absolutely shaped, is another sort of thing that the King James Bible is itself indebted to, and that it then serves to pass on not just its own legacy, but the legacy of other prior translators as well, both in English and otherwise. And then actually, in the wake of the King James Bible's publication, in the Netherlands, they're interested then in producing a new Dutch version of the Bible. And the King James Bible, the composition of the King James Bible at the Synod of Dort is one of the things that is suggested as a potential model for this undertaking. So the King James Bible is a part of a more global story in that respect too. Yeah.
Well, listeners, in the U.S. anyways, in English, I know we still have a King James version of the Bible, and then you have like New NIV, New International Version, or NAB.
Right.
And so, could you comment on those translations now and how King James Bible sort of influences or holds up in that?
Yeah, I mean, different people have different perspectives on sort of how it holds up in relation to those other translations. One of the things that's interesting about the King James Bible is that the King James translation continues to change after its first publication in 1611. So what readers say in the 1800s or the 1900s will come to think of as the King James translation is a translation that in a sense only gets locked into place, I think, sometime in the 1700s, if not late 1700s, I think. So there's a process of change that is, the King James translation is itself being revised, sometimes by people who were involved in the original translation of it. Samuel Ward is reported to have been involved in a later edition of the King James translation. But then, so even, the King James translation itself goes on to change throughout time. Eventually, it gets locked sort of into place, and that is what becomes what we tend to think of as the King James translation of the Bible. And it's not wholly dissimilar, or very like the one that is first published in 1611, though not identical in every way. Then there are lots of later translations, many of them excellent. One of the things that is often said about these translations is that they tend to build a lot on cutting edge, more recent scholarship and scholarly understanding of the ancient texts of the Bible that stand behind the King James translation. And so in that sense, a lot of those translations are in various ways better, more accurate than the King James Bible, at least viewed one way, right? So you could argue that the King James Bible in various places misunderstands some underlying Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek word or the context of something that stands behind of the text that they're translating. On the other hand, as one who's tried to translate anything will tell you, accuracy is a hugely important part, especially if you're translating a religious text. But it's not the entire part of one's job. And I think that even translations that have proven to be more accurate have also often proven to be less beloved. And that's an interesting part of the story of the King James Bible as well, that sort of sometimes certain translations get so kind of lodged in the cultural memory or something that even if they're a kind of mistranslation, it becomes hard to change them. It won't sound right to people at that point.
Yeah. And so you'll be listening now to Dr. Peter Ruckman in a message on the importance of the King James Version of the Bible.
How does someone like you get interested in this as a topic? Is it purely academic? To spend one's life looking into these historic texts, especially in the Christian world texts. But how did that spark for you?
It's in some ways, yes, it is. It's not purely academic, but it's very academic. It's a very sort of academic. I think these are extremely rich texts and issues to explore from an academic perspective, as I try to do. I'm an English professor. I'm not a minister or something. That being said, I was raised in a religious household, though not a doctrinaire religious household. My mom is Catholic. My dad is Baptist. I grew up going to both forms of church service. My grandfather was a Baptist Sunday school teacher. My dad was also a Baptist Sunday school teacher. They both taught out of the King James Bible. So I grew up around the King James Bible. I grew up around religion in general. Religion was something that was certainly taken very seriously in my household and was taken seriously on an intellectual or academic level too, not solely as something intellectually or academically important and rewarding, but also not as something that one should be loath to consider from an intellectual or academic perspective. So it was always a huge part of who I was and what I was then sort of myself became interested in. I then went to a Jesuit high school, though I'm not Catholic, that I found that interest, that academic interest, cultivated all the more, again, a place that very much seemed to consider religious questions as worthwhile and important things to consider intellectually. And I think from that point forward, it's hard for me to remember a time when I wasn't really interested in the intersection between literature, history, and religion or theology. And certainly almost every one of my favorite works of literature, the things that I've always gravitated towards, whether it's Milton or the King James Bible or Flannery O'Connor or Marilyn Robinson or Dostoevsky or Herman Melville, are things where religion or theological questions are treated with great seriousness, great urgency, great intensity. And I've always really found myself gravitating to those kinds of works intellectually, academically. And I think it would be silly to pretend that had nothing to do with personally my background, where I came from.
You were not looking apparently for the King James Bible discovery that you ended up finding, right? What were you looking for?
No, so I definitely wasn't looking for this early draft of the King James Bible, in part because not only did we not know that this particular modern scholarship did not know that this particular document existed. In a sense, it's a kind of draft that a certain understanding of how the King James Bible was assumed to have been conducted, it's a kind of draft that in a sense should not have existed at all. So you wouldn't have even sort of thought to look for it, even if you hoped to find something like it. The way it came about was that I was asked in 2011 at what was at the time the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible's initial publication. I was asked by a great intellectual historian at Caltech named Mordecai Feingold to write an essay about Samuel Ward, one of the known translators of the King James Bible. And I had done a little bit of work on Samuel Ward in the past, in connection with an essay about Milton that I wrote. Ward was the master of a college next door to Milton's at Cambridge when Milton was a student there. And so I'd done some work on Ward in the past, and one of the things that I think Professor Feingold was interested in exploring in this volume of essays was, so we have these 50 men, around 50 men, who were asked to be translators of the King James Bible, or who went on to be translators of it. In a few cases, it's very obvious why that person was asked. They have a very high-ranking office in the Church of England, or they're the Regius Professor of Hebrew at Cambridge, something like that. But in a lot of the cases, it's still a little bit unclear why you ever would have asked that particular person at that time to work on something like this. And relatedly, well, what was that person doing? What other sorts of stuff had that person been doing, and did they go on to do in the wake of their having been involved in the composition of the King James Bible? Ward is one of these people who's always been a slight mystery how he gets put onto it. He's one of the youngest people selected to be one of the translators of the King James Bible. So I was asked to really go and ultimately write an essay thinking about what sorts of other things was Samuel Ward up to around, or in and around this time. So I knew that a bunch of his papers and miscellaneous manuscripts survived in the archives of Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, the college that he had gone on to be the master of. And so I was really just going there trying to kind of look at everything that was there and see what I could gather about what Samuel Ward was doing around this time. What were his interests like? What was he reading? What other things might he have been writing? Very early on, I found a draft of a letter that Samuel Ward wrote to someone concerning a portion of the Bible that I knew he had been involved in translating as a King James translator, and it was written around either just when he would have been finishing or just after he would have been involved in the project. So I thought that was actually going to be my great discovery, and I found that very early on. And in fact, I wrote a whole draft of my own essay, basically kind of all about this letter. And it was actually on a subsequent research trip. There were a couple documents that I hadn't looked at myself yet, and I wanted, I kind of out of a completist strain or something, I wanted to know for my own sake that I had looked at everything. Yeah. So it was on one of these kind of just mopping up research trips where I called up a manuscript identified now as MS Ward B, and it was in that manuscript notebook that there turned out to reside an early draft of part of the King James Bible in Samuel Ward's hands. So that meant that then this essay that I'd already spent a lot of time writing had to go in the bin, and I had to rewrite the whole thing. No, so I wasn't up until the day I laid eyes on it. I very much wasn't looking for anything like it. So it was a happy surprise on a variety of levels.
Yeah. I guess it's like Indiana Jones for literary scholars, right?
Sort of, yeah. Like right. Although, it's one of those things that maybe a little bit, I know sometimes archivists, obviously, anytime someone wants to compare me to Harrison Ford, like, I'll take it. Yeah. But, I would say, sometimes archivists rightly kind of bridle at it's kind of the Indiana Jones comparison, in part because I think it gives the public an impression that these manuscripts are sort of languishing, neglected in some sort of cave that you then spelunk down into. Where in fact, actually, the story of how this came to be identified is a story that relies on and builds upon the work of generations of scholars, archivists, librarians who cataloged these manuscripts, helped ensure their survival into the present. And so in that sense, I don't identify what this is, if not for two people just right off the bat. One is an archivist named Nicholas Rogers, who's the archivist at Sidney Sussex, and he's there the whole time when you request a specific manuscript, he goes and takes care of it. He brings it out to you. He'll help you in any way you want to, or any way you need. He's an incredibly generous and knowledgeable person.
Wow.
It's also the case that the only reason I even knew this manuscript was there in a broad sense, that there was a manuscript called MS Ward B. It had been cataloged as containing an unknown biblical commentary on an unknown biblical book. But even the fact, but that was really useful information. Like, it turned out to be not quite what it was.
Yeah.
But that catalog had been put together in the 80s by a really brilliant intellectual historian now at Penn named Margot Todd. And, without Todd's catalog, I don't know that manuscript is there to call it up and then look at it and look at it more closely and figure out what it really is, in a sense. And so in that sense, it's a little bit different from the kind of Indiana Jones sort of discovery, right? It's a discovery that relied upon centuries worth of prior discoveries and prior work by archivists, librarians, scholars, teachers, to sort of pave the way for this identification. And without all of those steps along the way over the course of 400 years, it would have not been identified.
Right. And I wonder, for listeners, okay, if you open the Samuel Ward book, the type of English we're looking at is not what a normal person could probably understand, right? I don't know how many people in the world can actually sort of read that text and figure out what it actually was.
It is a challenge.
What was that? What was it like? What is it? Old English?
So it's written in not Old English in the sense of classic, Old English being like what Beowulf is written in. It sort of sounds sort of Scandinavian, Germanic. So it's written in early modern English. The parts of it are, the English of the King James Bible, the English of Shakespeare, the English of Milton. In some sense, I'm always telling my students, that's not Old English. That's modern English. That's your English, right? You speak Shakespeare's English and he speaks your English, in a sense, and you speak his English because he spoke your English, and vice versa, right? And the same thing is true of the King James Bible and Milton. It is the case, though, that so it's written in Samuel Ward's handwriting. Samuel Ward's handwriting was known to be bad at the time. So even by the time's own standards, he had bad handwriting. It's also case that early modern, what we would call early modern cursive or script, some of the letters look very different than modern English cursive or script. So that makes it, you're sort of reading someone with bad handwriting, writing a kind of a form of English that, at least at the visual level, may not align in every way with what you would identify as English script. It's also the case that a huge amount of the draft exists in other languages besides English. So one of the texts that Ward is involved in working out the translation of is a text that survived in Greek. And so the draft takes more or less the form throughout of, he'll quote a bit from the bishop's Bible that he thinks he wants to query or that he thinks could stand some revision. He'll quote that bit from the bishop's Bible. He'll then quote the underlying Greek text that the bishop's Bible itself was trying to translate or should have been trying to translate. And then he'll propose his own English translation. And then he'll sometimes then sort of add thoughts to himself in Latin. So one of the things that's very clear is that Ward thinks to himself in Latin in the process of even trying to compose this English translation. And then there's bits of Hebrew that are interjected in the draft throughout as well. So this is a draft that exists in 4 languages: Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and English. So even if you can read Ward's English handwriting, which is hard, that is still only getting you kind of a quarter of the way there. The manuscript has actually been fully digitized online, so if people want to go and look and just get a visual, this is what it looks like. You can find it if you just Google MS Ward B, Sydney, Sussex, Cambridge. You'll find it. Cambridge's University Library Digital Archives has digitized the whole thing. And I've written a little introduction for it with some hyperlinks to some representative pages. So people can kind of navigate it on a visual level. But that's one of the things that I'm hoping this edition of the King James Bible, this edition of that draft.
Where is this leading? Is there a revival of Samuel Ward's life and works? And where has this find out? Where is it leading you in terms of output.
Yeah, so one of the things, I mean, I hope there's a revival of interest in Samuel Ward. I don't know, that may be sort of utopian.
Right.
But I find him certainly very interesting. That might be sort of a team of 1 or 2 or 3 or something. But one of the things that I'm doing is trying to produce a complete critical edition and study of this early draft of part of the King James Bible. So one of the things that will do will transcribe the entirety of the thing. So if you can't read Ward's handwriting, which is it can be tough.
Strong likelihood.
Yeah, it can be tough even for specialists, certainly for non-specialists. I've shown it to specialists who have a hard time with it.
Yeah.
And these are people whose job it is not to have a hard time with it, right? In a sense, right?
Yeah.
So it'll have a full transcription of everything, so you'll be able to sort of see exactly what is being said at every moment. The edition will also then translate all the bits that are not in English, so you'll be able to then read those as well, even if you don't know Latin or Greek or Hebrew. Then they'll have a kind of running commentary throughout, as well as a very full introduction, helping the reader see exactly what Ward is trying to do at any given moment. Or at least what he thinks he's trying to do. And then trying to help the reader see then how this early draft of the King James Bible gave rise, and portions of it still exist in what will become the first published edition of the King James Bible in 1611. Wow. So trying to sort of help the reader see how we go from this draft to the King James Bible in its eventual published form. So that's definitely a big project that I'm working on at the time.
Wow. And I hear you've not gotten away from Milton, that Milton has been an abiding research interest.
No, very much. Yeah. Milton, I often say he's the beating heart of everything I do. And I still feel that way. I love Milton. And I'm really interested in early modern literature, theology, and history more broadly. So early modern. What do we miss
on Milton from a theology or Christian history standpoint?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, what we miss. Different people miss different things. One of the things I think that certainly I'm very interested in showing in a lot of the research that I'm doing is Milton is a very radical thinker. That's something that people have often long known about Milton. One of the things I'm interested in showing is that Milton is not just a radical thinker in the sense of thinking very heterodox ideas, but he's also a radical thinker in the sense that he's open to rethinking ideas, certain ideas, constantly. He changes his mind about things throughout the course of his career, which is not something that a kind of prior generation of scholarship concerning Milton often wanted to acknowledge. Milton himself likes to present himself as having always been the person he would become from the very beginning. And I think that when you actually look into it, however much Milton might have wanted to think that about himself, that's clearly not the way it worked for him, and it's probably not the way it works for anyone. So I'm really interested in thinking about the ways that Milton changes his mind about even very important theological issues that he took very seriously. And then I'm especially interested in thinking about the way that the writing process itself, so the process of composing the works that Milton devoted his life to composing, how that process itself served to shape or exerted a transformative influence on these changes of ideas on his part. So rather than thinking if Milton did change his idea, there's a kind of tradition of scholarship that has tended to want to then locate the engine of that change in, say, Milton's reading or Milton's social interactions. What must he have read to give him this idea? Who must he have known or been chatting with in the street or in the pub to give him this idea? And certainly my work is not trying to suggest that those things are that you're barking up the wrong tree thinking about that. Milton's reading, Milton's social interactions are very much clearly shaping his ideas. But one of the things I'm trying to show is that Milton's writing process itself is also shaping his own ideas. In a sense, Milton is thinking through writing and at various points in time writing his way into certain beliefs that when he sat down to write a work, he may not even himself have anticipated coming to uphold.
And I think the MacArthur notation about your award said he held a Christian view of history unfolding according to God's plan that mattered in his composition and his poetry and prose.
So one of the things that it's the subject of my first book, which feels like it's been in progress for 1,000 years. Basically, this is the term of my natural life, but hopefully nearing completion. I'm really interested in the way that Milton's belief in what would come to be known as theological typology not only shaped his works, but that becomes shaped his and other of his contemporaries' works very powerfully and controversially, but that it becomes a lens for thinking about the way that the writing process more broadly could exert this shaping influence. What theological or early modern typology was fundamentally was the belief that various persons, things or events in the past, usually in the time of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, had actually been put on earth by God to be types, drawing on a locution in the Greek of the Apostle Paul's, certain of the Apostle Paul's epistles, had been types or prefigurations or foreshadowings of certain persons, things, and events to come, usually in the time of Jesus of Nazareth and the New Testament. So the idea being that King David had literally been put on earth as a kind of embodied sign from God that the coming of a greater king in the future in the form of Jesus of Nazareth would arrive, right? Or so that when Moses holds up a bronze or brazen serpent affixed to a pole, that is itself a kind of embodied prophecy that of the crucifixion later on. Right. And so it's this belief that there are basically these kind of embodied prophecies or types in the past that are prefiguring things to come in the future, or that at least things to come in what was the future at one point and may now also be the past. That's an idea that Milton took. It can seem a little bit nutty. It's an idea that Milton took extremely seriously. A lot of Milton's contemporaries also took it very seriously, and it exerted a really interesting, controversial, at times volatile pull on their work. So one of the things I'm interested in showing is that in the process of writing about typology, Milton and some of his contemporaries will often sort of spin out in unpredictable directions. And that then helps to show how typology itself played a role in shaping certain developments, but also the way that the process of writing about typology and then the writing process kind of more broadly also played a role in shaping those developments. And that's really what the book is trying to show in the aggregate.
You know, we look at research data from a week or two ago that showed, you know, America's becoming in some sense less religious, especially younger generations. And we look at the humanities and we see challenges in sort of those of us who work at liberal arts colleges or teach humanities related subjects. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts on, as someone who teaches, students here, are there consequences for those trends? And is there should we worry about those trends?
There are a couple things I would say about that. One thing is, since you mentioned our students, I should take the time to plug. I teach at Montclair State. We have the best students in the world. So prospective students or any parents that might be listening, please do reach out to us or consider us. We'd love to have you here. And I think we have a lot to offer here. In terms of how concerned one should be about those trends, certainly as someone who takes religion seriously and thinks that it can be a force for good, though even if I certainly concede that it hasn't always been into the present. And certainly as someone who's devoted his life to humanities research and thinks that is also a force for good and something very important in the world. There's certainly a way of looking at those trends and having it make one feel sort of quite bleak about things. And I would say that, those who I think history has shown time and again, I think almost on any metric, news today would show you that humanities research, humanities knowledge, humanities learning, students who major in humanities disciplines go on to play a really important, sought-after role in global communities. And that is true both on a kind of professional level. Study after study shows that the kinds of skills and the sort of thinking and expertise that is inculcated in English departments, history departments, religion departments, these philosophy departments. These are the kinds of skills that employers want. I think it's also the kinds of the people who the sorts of the way of thinking, the habits of mind that emerge out of those disciplines are the kinds of things that citizens and societies more broadly should want to have more of, not fewer of. So in that sense, anytime there's a sort of trend downward, and the extent to which society or a given society values certain things, it can seem alarming. As someone who spends a lot of his time studying the 1500s and 1600s, one of the things I'm sort of comforted by routinely is the fact that there were many times in those periods where people were quite convinced that something like the world was ending, and that all was lost or was soon to be lost. That has never proven true yet. Yeah. Humanities, literature, culture, these are remarkably resilient things. The King James Bible, Milton, Shakespeare, they've made it through a lot. And I think they both made it through a lot in their own lives, and they've made it through a lot of history between now and then. I don't think that means we can rest on our laurels and assume that 100 years people will still be reading and teaching and wanting to think about Paradise Lost or the King James Bible. But I also think that actually, if you're a betting person, the better bet is the assumption that actually they will be. And one of the things that I hope to do is just serve some sort of meager part in trying to ensure that that's the case, and that in 100 years, when people are studying those things, as I believe they will be, and as I certainly hope they will be, that we have maybe a greater understanding of them in certain ways than we do today. And if I can sort of help sort of further that mission in one way or another, I think it'll be a life well spent.
This episode of the Religion Unplugged podcast was hosted by Paul Glatter, edited and produced by Peter Freeby. Special thanks to Melissa Harrison and Megan Clark. The Religion Unplugged podcast is a production of religionunplugged.com and is part of The Media Project, a nonprofit dedicated to equipping journalists to cover religion. To read our award-winning global religion news coverage, or to find out more about Religion Unplugged or The Media Project, visit religionunplugged.com or follow us on Twitter at ReligionMag.